Strings of Malice, Book 1. Snowflake in an Alley. An Old Mother Nonsense Story. Chapter 4. Dramatic Doctor. Old Mother Nonsense returns with candy and more blankets. Your choices are one with golden thread, and another is simply white cotton. Your sister begins reaching out with determined hands, but she stops when the woman speaks directly to you, offering you the first choice. The way her words sound to your ears hints at something deeper, something that you can pick up on, but not quite understand. There's just the tiniest bit of a smirk in her smile when you choose the white one despite the chill. Your sister squeals and her threats are forgotten when she declares you the best sibling in the world. It is an effort to hide your grin when you unfold the blanket you've chosen, and inside is lined with the softest fur you have ever felt. It doesn't bother you nearly as much as it should that the feeling reminds you of the puppy whose departure enticed you to the story weaver's hearth in the first place, and you snuggle in for the next leg of the tale. Brickdal, 10th Yacht. The movement of the train helped Lunreth rest, and the next morning he found Irinka already sitting at the window again, staring out at the forest rushing by. It was early, but that was good. They had things to do before breakfast. He gathered a few odds and ends and wrapped them in a small towel from his bag, along with some fresh clothes, and closed the door behind him. He walked up to the conductor of their cart and handed the man a letter. It took a moment before the man admitted he couldn't read, and Lunreth, while annoyed, wasn't surprised. The morning man in orange was young, like the other, and he looked tired, probably night shift. "I can," a cheerful voice said from behind them, and Lunreth turned to see the gentleman who'd passed them when they had boarded, sans his hound. He was an older man, and spoke with an accent Lunreth couldn't quite place. It sounded to definitely be an amalgamation of more than one. The sailor got the distinct impression that it had been carefully contoured into being deliberately obscure. He quickly nodded in thanks, and the conductor handed over the letter without having to be asked. The gentleman looked it over, his bracelets, exchanged for jewel-dropped earrings this morning, and nodded in that manner men of breeding did when they agreed with general dignity.
"Yes, it certainly would be preferable. I wonder if my fetching companion would be opposed to the idea."
He vanished the note into a pocket, and gave all assurances he would make inquiries while Lunreth was attending to himself, the conductor having run off at the ring of a bell from the compartment with the children. Well, it was odd, such help from a stranger when their classes were so clearly leagues apart. Lunreth offered his hand to shake the gentleman's, and, to his credit, he took it without hesitation. Lunreth vaguely heard the man muttering to himself as he strode down the corridor, but only caught the tail end of
"Wake the missus,"
and
"Breakfast at 7."
By the time the sailor returned from his morning ablutions, the conductor from their time of boarding approached him and assured him all was settled, that someone would be by in a few moments to retrieve his sister. True to his word, a knock at their door a few moments later revealed the woman who'd turned up her nose at them at the station. Her face was pinched in that proper way, and a neat little basket held over her arm, crumpling the sleeve of her heavily embroidered morning robes. Lunreth inclined his head at her, and her face pinched more, if only minutely.
"Good morning, missus,"
Irinka offered helpfully upon watching the exchange. The woman hummed as understanding came to her eyes.
"Oh, well, there is always something the matter with the handsome ones."
She sighed heavily and waved Lunreth aside as one might do for a bug.
"Come along, girl. We must be done before breakfast."
Irinka looked at her, confusion clearly written across her face, but Lunreth offered his sister both a smile and a hand to take her from her seat. The girl took his hand suspiciously, though didn't complain when her brother handed her over to the woman. She clearly cared nothing for the girl's trembling knees as she marched them down to the bathing compartment. Lunreth hoped the street mouse would do as she was told, but a loud splash and a disgruntled yelp told him otherwise. He chuckled to himself and hoped she would forgive him in time. At 7:15, on the dot, there came a knock at his door, and the conductor informed him that he was to meet one Dr. Griscaris for breakfast. Lunreth tried to gesture to ask the man where Irinka was, but he got the same look he usually did from people unaccustomed to him, blank eyes and the faintest pinch of irritation between their brows. Quickly noticing that he was getting nowhere, Lunreth simply walked past the washroom. He could hear Irinka's muffled voice behind the door, but didn't catch what she was saying before she was cut off and told sternly to desist with her nonsense or they'd miss breakfast. He chuckled silently to himself and turned in the direction of the dining cart. The cart was all white tablecloths and the second finest silverware. Lunreth made a point of keeping his hands in his pockets, especially when he passed the long-nosed newspaper man from the station, and the gentleman eyed him with suspicion. The polite thing, to suppose, would be force of habit, on both sides. The gentleman from that morning, however, was easy enough to spot, what with the way he was waving Lunreth over. Anyone watching would have thought they were old friends.
"I am glad you have come,"
the supposed doctor beamed.
Come, sit.
He invited, gesturing with ringed fingers, and the tails of his travelling clothes clicked with the precious metal threads woven through them. There was only one kingdom who did that, and only for very specific people. It made Lunreth tense. The doctor appeared to misinterpret his unease and quickly set about assuring his new friend.
"I trust the ladies will be along shortly. Please believe me that your sister is in excellent hands,"
the gentleman encouraged as they took their seats. The hound had returned, laying dutifully beneath the table at its master's feet.
"Not to speak generally,"
he prefaced before doing precisely that.
"But there is always a waiting game to be played with beautiful women. Don't you find? They are always quite fashionably late to nearly everything."
Lunreth gestured to the scars that crept up his neck and offered the man his version of a dubious smile.
"Ah, indeed."
The man nodded sagely, hand coming to his pointy beard dramatically.
"I take it you rarely wait on beautiful women. I'd wager you're the kind of man to not wait on any woman, or man for that matter. You seem the practical type. Oh, and the names here, I am forgetting myself. Dr. Nulam Grascares."
The man stuck out his hand with all the enthusiasm of a person who had probably shaken hands with many. Lunreth shook the hand before pulling out his notebook. He flipped to the first page. He'd written the short introduction for himself many a year ago now. He would have to get a new notebook soon. However, the inscription still fulfilled its intended purpose as he handed it over. The doctor's eyes scanned it before he gestured for the waiter and requested a pen.
"You don't mind, do you?"
he inquired, generally pointing down at the page.
"I dare say you will have a much easier time of things if your grammar were not quite so backwards."
Lunreth shook his head and gestured for the man to go right on ahead. The doctor considered what he might be asking a moment before seeming to catch on.
"Ah, I am a doctor in linguistics,"
he beamed proudly.
"Come with the young lady Moonrisk you met this morning as a translator. Mind you, I'd not known her awfully long before we were boarding."
The waiter produced a pen and an inkwell on a small silver tray, and Dr. Grascaris ordered him away again, to return with a light wine.
"Poor girl's usual one was apparently a poison tester too. Killed over just a few nights ago,"
he continued, even as he dipped the pen and proceeded to cross out and fill in the apparent mistakes Lunreth had made.
"Such an oversight, to have the only one who can speak for you also do the dangerous task of testing your food. I would not be so silly. No, I have common sense, you see."
Lunreth chose not to comment, and set his attention to the corrections. He recognized about half of the changes before assuming the remainder were highbrow Shadanian.
Now look here, friend,
the doctor prattled on as he turned the book back to face its owner.
I have given you 2 inscriptions. One is commonplace throughout Milan, and the other, well, it is a fair bit more formal. They'll be able to understand it in Ithersta as well, if your journey takes you that far south. Do you see how the article moves this way, and the spelling changes from I to Y?
Lunreth nodded along and thanked the man before gesturing for the pen. The doctor handed it over, while explaining the barely discernible differences in pronunciation, but his words stopped before his new acquaintance had even turned to a new page.
If my hound was to lay its head on your feet, I may be permitted to read your mind,
he offered rather simply.
If you would prefer that over writing.
He smiled, seemingly unaware of how Lunreth had gone dead still, too caught up in stroking his small beard and looking around for the waiter.
It may enable our conversation to be a good deal smoother than your scribbling. Then again, it may help you to practice with a proficient this morning.
It took Lunreth a tense moment to decide to agree. If the doctor was anything but overtly friendly, he wasn't giving it away. The sailor closed his book and nodded slowly as he deliberately returned the pen to the inkwell. He didn't see the man make a single move, but he did hear the hound shift beneath the table and felt the gentle weight of a nuzzle rest itself upon his boots.
I can compel her with my thoughts to do as I wish.
The doctor answered his unspoken question with a hapless shrug.
My parents got her for me as a child, but I was in no way the kind of youngling to be out and about training dangerous animals.
He shivered overtly with distaste.
They were beyond irritated when they came to discover I had bypassed their attempted lesson of responsibility, but the risk was worth it.
Lunreth had barely considered the next thought before the man laughed aloud, though it was a little colder than before.
I do expect that it may appear that way, but no.
He shook his head.
No, I cannot compel you the same way, nor would I. I understand you have had a hard life, sir, but that is no reason to suspect everyone is out to be horrid.
Lunreth calmed his mind and brought his fist up to his chest, moving it in a circle, even as he thought. I'm sorry, Doctor. I'm not used to friendly strangers having the best intentions. The gentleman's laugh was less offended that time, and he nodded as he gave up on beckoning service to lean back in his seat.
Quite true,
he agreed eagerly.
Let me put your mind at ease. Our meeting this morning was not, as you suspect, entirely coincidence. Rest assured,
he quickly continued, raising his hands defensively.
Nothing nefarious. I may have witnessed you and your sister at the station before we departed. I noticed how she seemed to hold an entire conversation on her own. She does have the most interesting accent, and it took me quite a moment to conclude that she was reading your hands, so to say. Obviously, telepathy was not involved, and being rather in love with my field, I simply had to speak to you and discover how you are communicating, and if you might be interested in an experiment.
Lunreth wasn't sure how to answer at first, and it obviously showed on his face because the doctor laughed again.
Forgive my enthusiasm. You see, I simply have never seen anyone of your condition so adept at communicating non-magically.
That brought a smile to Lunreth's face, and he reassured the doctor it was all right. It was good to see people excited about their professions, and it was the first in a very long time. He felt as though he were having a real conversation. He explained how Irinka and he were working mostly off literal gestures, facial expressions, and logic. How there was a struggle when it came to abstract concepts and explanations, but they were doing all right. They had settled on a few general ones, and he showed the doctor the gestures for common phrases like thanks and apologies, coin and food, numbers and weight. He deliberately didn't demonstrate the ones they used in dangerous situations. Instead, he showed the sign he'd created for her name. He had been rather proud of that one.
Simply remarkable.
The doctor nodded, completely enraptured and watching as Lunreth gestured along with his thoughts, almost unaware he was doing it.
And in only a week? How wonderfully adept you and your sister are.
Lunreth heard the intonation change and his smile faltered, but the doctor waved away his concern and ordered more wine when the waiter misunderstood and finally thought himself called upon.
Ah, now that is particularly the problem I have been having,
he sighed, gazing after the young man.
As you say, logic helps, but it is not universal, and gestures can be so different across kingdoms. Mr. Reed, I have a proposition for you.
Lunreth inclined his head as he accepted to hear what the doctor would propose.
I have, in my sphere of acquaintance, a young lad who has recently lost his ability to hear. Not quite the same predicament you find yourself in, however. His family has asked yours truly to discover a method by which the child may be taught to communicate. Magic is off the table. They're a paranoid bunch, who worry what might happen if the lad were bound to some devil by accidental ritual, or to find himself in a dead place. They are, however, willing to pay a large sum for a relatively simple to learn and easy to replicate mode of communication. I believe you and your sister have already got quite a good start on things.
Lunreth fiddled idly with the edge of the tablecloth that brushed his thighs, wondering what it was the doctor needed from him.
We have 8 days until we reach Monkakus,
the man explained.
I am sure I can craft a spell in that time, but some materials will need to be found upon our arrival. If you would agree, I would like to place a spell into an object. Nothing too cumbersome, perhaps a ring. One that will monitor the gestures you do while thinking of specific things. If your sister is not opposed, I will give her one too. The data will be better coming from both a speaker and a receiver. These would then be linked to a tome, which will record and scribe into itself the gestures you use and understand most frequently. The process may need some refining, but the outcome would be to effectively create a mute language.
Lunreth cocked his head curiously, and Dr. Griscares listened to his question before shaking his head and waving his hand.
No, I have tried with speaking individuals. Not with the spell, mind you, but it was a good thing too. They inevitably got frustrated at it taking too long to be understood, and reverted back to speaking with rather alarming abandon. And then there was the fact that they kept forgetting what they had and hadn't made gestures for. Not to mention the tedium of...
The doctor's voice trailed off as his gaze was drawn over Lunreth's shoulder, and all speech died on his tongue. Lunreth turned in his seat to discover what had distracted him. There, at the entrance to the dining cart, a fashionable half-hour late, were the ladies. The woman, Lady Moonrisk, was dressed up in red, flowing robes with exotic birds embroidered up the lapels in gold. A golden pin kept her dark curls off her neck, only the spaces where jewels ought to fit lay bare. Beside her, 2 parts terrified and 1 part furious, stood Irinka. In much the same, if more simple, her borrowed gown had accents of black with golden flowers. Lunreth turned back to his breakfast companion and tapped him lightly on the back of the hand. When the gentleman looked at him, Lunreth rose his hand up from the elbow and bent his wrist so his hand was perpendicular to the table, and tucked his thumb under to settle into the groove of his fore and middle finger.
Yes, she is Congorian.
Dr. Griscares nodded, and hearing his own voice seemed to break the spell he'd been trapped into at their arrival. He quickly rose and greeted the woman, in much the same way he had done with Lunreth, although now there was certainly an audience. Lunreth caught Irinka's gaze from around the side of the doctor's sweeping arm movements as he bestowed flowery words upon his mistress and her young new friend. The sailor smiled at his sister, gesturing down the length of her and bringing the back of his fingers up under one side of his chin. She rolled her eyes at him aggressively and slipped past the lady and the doctor to quickly make her way over to her horrible, terrible, dreadful brother. She had just about fell into the seat beside him when she tripped over the flowing skirts.
"You're the worst,"
she hissed softly, trying to make herself comfortable without damaging the fine fabric.
"That woman tried to drown me and then dressed me up like some clown. What is all this nonsense for? Just so I can eat? Every day won't be like this, will it?"
A hand landed firmly on the girl's shoulder, and even Lunreth would admit it had taken him by surprise. Both of their heads snapped up to look at the lady apprehensively. Her face was tight as she stared down her nose at the two of them.
"It most certainly shall,"
she stated, as though it were already fact.
"And every evening you will wash your hands and face as I showed you. I do not care if you grew up in the gutter, girl. While you sit at my table, you will be clean."
Irinka looked about ready to snap something back in return, but a withering look from the lady silenced her, and she could only muster the courage to nod meekly and reply,
"Yes, Miss Nemo."
Lady Moonrisk showed her approval with a curt hum and removed her hand, tucking it up into her sleeves. She didn't need to ask the waiter to pull out her chair as she sat and ignored him, in that way that only the intensely prudish could do to those deemed to be beneath them. She may very well have been the most beautiful woman in the world, but Lunreth was no longer at a loss as to why someone may want to poison her. Dr. Gascaris glared at Lunreth, but it could hardly be threatening when the corners of the doctor's lips were barely holding back an agreeable smile.
"Good girl. Now sit opposite your brother."
Lady Moonrisk's order broke the moment.
"A lady does not sit next to a man she has no familiarity with in public."
"But he's my brother,"
the girl denied softly.
"I believe she means me, miss."
Dr. Gascaris intervened quickly, already offering the girl a gentlemanly hand to help her change seats.
"If you would do us this favor, it would be much appreciated. Mr. Reed and myself were just finishing up some business."
Irinka looked ready to protest, but Lunreth tapped her arm and showed her his hand, rubbing his fingers together. The prospect of money was obviously one his sister understood, because she took the offered hand, admittedly with a sigh, and did as she was told. The doctor practically fawned at the understanding that happened before his eyes, and declared them both utterly magnificent. By the time breakfast was done, Irinka had agreed to participate, if Dr. Gascaris paid them at least 15% of the profit, along with 2 liter a week's salary until the book was complete. It was a hard sell, but everyone at the table seemed impressed that the street mouse actually had the wherewithal to barter at all.